Okay, I'm just waiting for the message to appear on the screen. Okay, the meeting is now recording, so I will take the sederant for the Financial Resources Scrutiny Forum on Thursday the 30th of September 2021. Do we have Councillor Brogan? No. Councillor Buchanan? No. I have apologies from Councillor Kalikes and Councillor Donnelly. Do we have Councillor Gray substituting for Councillor Donnelly?
Yes, I'm here. I'm substituting for Councillor Donnelly.
Thank you. I can see that we have Councillor Ferguson and Councillor Holford. Do we have Councillor Lennon? No. And I can see that we have Councillor McAdams and Councillor Wark. Officers present today are Jackie Taylor, Lorena Hagan, Derek Craig, Karen MacLeod and myself, Carol Lyon. I'll pass back to yourself now, Chair.
Thanks very much. Okay, has anybody got any interest to declare? Okay, excellent. Okay, so looking at the minutes of the previous meeting, that was pages 3 to 6. Are we happy with the minutes?
Happy.
Okay, Jackie, were you going to jump in?
I was, thanks, Chair. It was just in response to the question that was asked last time by Councillor Gray around the recruitment for social workers. We had asked our colleagues in personnel around this, and what we were advised was that recruitment for social workers, and indeed social work generally, is an ongoing activity. Requests to recruit are processed as a priority within the personnel team, and guidance is provided to hiring managers on how to recruit in the most effective manner. So whilst we'll continue to see underspends in relation to vacancies within social work, they are being progressed as a priority. Hope that helps. Thanks.
That's great, Jackie. Thank you very much for updating me on that. Thank you.
Okay, excellent. Right, so can I look for a seconder for the minutes then, please?
Yep.
Okay, Eric, spot on. Thank you very much. Okay, I'll move on to 3A. So this is the capital budget monitoring. So this is the General Fund Capital Programme. It's on pages 7 to 26. And I'll hand over to Jackie.
Thanks, Chair. So as Chair's explained, this is the capital budget monitoring report for our General Fund Capital Programme, and it covers the period to the 13th of August this year. Section 4 of the report covers the position, and at 4.1 we report that the capital programme for this year totals £83.3 million. This includes adjustments to the programme totalling a net decrease of £2.1 million, which are detailed in the appendices, and we'll cover them in a second, and they were approved at the Executive Committee last week. Section 4.3 of the report details that spend to the 13th of August this year was just over £13 million, which is a slight underspend of £297,000. Over the page on section 5, we cover contract prices, and this is in relation to construction materials and supply chain issues that we've reported previously here. And as we've reported, various options are being employed by property services and procurement where appropriate in order to mitigate these risks. And we'll continue to report back to the forum and committee on any issues arising from that. If I go to the appendices, Appendix A shows the adjustments to the programme that were approved at the Executive Committee last week. They include additional funds in relation to Alexander Hamilton Memorial Park, the Woodlands Management, and that's being funded from a reserve, so that's £77,000. We've had additional funding in from the Scottish Government in relation to renewal of play parks. This is a first instalment of our share of 60 million. At the moment, 5 million has been distributed to councils. We've got £298,000 at the moment. And there was a paper at the Community and Enterprise Resources Committee this week in relation to that. There's also funding from the government of £264,000 in relation to the Nature Restoration Fund. And officers are currently working on proposed projects on what can be delivered this year in relation to that. On education resources, We have adjusted the programme for the nursery at Clyde Terrace in Bothwell, and this reflects the profile of spend expected in relation with that nursery. And on finance and corporate resources, as detailed in a separate report that was agreed at the Finance and Corporate Resources Committee, there's a requirement to upgrade our core HR and finance system, which is Oracle. Now, there will be a requirement for funds to be borrowed for that project, and the new system will allow savings to be made that will cover the cost of running the new system and the cost of borrowing for the project. So those are the adjustments that were approved at the Executive Committee last week. Appendix B of the report shows the overall summary with resource budgets, and that totals the 83.3 revised programme that I mentioned earlier. And then Appendix C breaks that down further over specific services and showing actual spend as well. So the right-hand column shows actual spend to the 13th of August, totalling £16 million. Appendix D goes into the funding of the capital programme. This very much reflects what we've reported to previous meetings, with the majority of funding coming from borrowing and from Scottish Government grant. And then into Appendix E, we start to go into the physical progress of our projects, and Derek can take us through those. Thanks.
Yeah, Chair, on page 15 we are on now, the Build Executive Summary shows at period 5 that we were had one project behind programme, and over the page on page 16 it lists that as Castlebank Park. So we've had some difficulties with the contractor getting staff due to COVID isolations and such like. Over the page onto page 17 is the non-Build Executive Summary. There are no projects behind that on that programme. And we then jump to the Roads Executive Summary on page 19, and also within that programme there's no projects behind programme.
Okay, listen, that's excellent. Thanks very much. Does anybody have any questions? We would direct to either Jackie or Derek. Eric?
Wouldn't be a forum if I didn't ask some questions. Yeah, two things really. One, the contract pricing, the attempts we've got to mitigate that, or the methods that we've got to mitigate that, are they having an effect, and are they mitigating the problems? That's the first thing, and then I'll ask something about play parks, but we'll do them one at a time.
Okay.
I'll probably hand over to Derek in a second around any mitigations, because they're probably more practical mitigations. What we've reported previously here is that these are being, I suppose, managed and monitored on a project by project basis. In terms of the financial implications, we have seen, and we'll see in a second, on the housing programme, some of the decisions might be that projects will take a bit longer or might be delayed slightly in order to try and mitigate some of these issues. We haven't seen any significant price issues coming through in terms of our monitoring, but we will continue to keep an eye on that. And each of those, again, will have to be managed on a project by project basis to see what our options are around the financial implications there. Derek, can I ask you to come in the practical side of this?
Yeah, just as the paper suggests, we are dealing with those on a kind of two-tier basis, if you like. One where we're trying to help the contractors to limit their exposure to price fluctuations from the time when they tender to when they actually get an award of contract, so that they can secure those prices. So we're trying to cut that down as much as we can, so that we get back to them and award the contract as quickly as possible. That helps them get the fixed prices that they got at the time they were tendering the projects, rather than have to come back to us and say, no, I'm sorry, we're going to have to withdraw that offer. We can't do it at that price anymore. So that's one sort of practical element that we're doing. We're also looking at where we can use alternative materials, perhaps very similar in specification, but available from different factories that are maybe not as impacted by production So we've had a few instances of that where we've looked at different types of materials to make sure that the same outcomes are being achieved, but through changing the specification, we're actually getting the materials when we need them. So we're avoiding delays in that regard, and therefore price increases as well.
Okay. My other question is to do with the play parks. Well, it's not really a question, it's more a comment, really. £298 million, our first tranche from that. I'm always concerned that the amount of money, £60 million sounds like a lot of money, but we've 233 play parks, and so the cost of refurbishing play parks that we've done so far in Clydesdale usually costs between £100 and £175,000, average nearer the 100. So there's about enough money to refurbish every play park in, say, North and South Lanarkshire. There wouldn't be enough to do much more than that, but the rest of Scotland would dip out if that was the case. But the first £298,000 that we've got here, not one penny of it is actually going to go on refurbishing play parks. It's all being spent on new staff to do a survey of our play parks, which I would have thought we should already know are in a pretty dire state and require work. So I really wanted to make that as a comment rather than ask anybody to ask a question of anybody. Thank you.
Okay, noted. Thank you. Grant.
So on the report on page number 10, at the bottom, about the financial resources. So they're talking about the system upgrades, the HR system upgrades, and the software. So on the first paragraph, on page 11, it mentions the first 2 years is protected. So does that mean it's possible to, is it just for the 2 years, or is it going to be extended over 3 or 4 years as well? Is there going to be extra? So I was just wondering, because there's no like date or anything.
Okay.
So for that funding, is it just for the 2 years, or is it possible to be extended? That's my question. And
Okay.
there's no like start date or end date, sorry, for the project. So that's what I'd like to know. Can it be over like 2, 3, 4 years, and as they're developing the system? So we've got the first 2 years, and we're doing the first part, the middle. So if you could explain a bit more about that. Is it going to be fixed, or?
I can take that, Chair.
Thank you very much.
The narrative on the report refers to what we'll fund from the capital programme. So we expect that the implementation should be complete within a 2-year period. So what we're suggesting here is that the costs of the licensing will be picked up by the capital budget in those 2 years. But going forward, there will be ongoing annual costs of the licenses because it's a cloud-based system. And that can all be met within the existing IT budget and the savings that will be made from implementing this new system. So hopefully that gives Councillor Ferguson a understanding of the time period that we're talking about in terms of implementation. And then we go on to normal annual costs, and that'll be picked up through our revenue budget.
Okay. Grant, do you have any subsequent questions?
Nope, that's absolutely fine. That clarifies that. Thank you. So it'll be within the first 2 years. That's great. I wasn't sure what was going to be subsequently, or if that was going to be extended. But for the annual cost for the license, so that makes sense. For the project, yeah. So for the new system, yeah, that's perfect. Thank you very much for explaining that to me.
Cool. Eric, do you know what I was going to say to you? I don't have the papers to hand, but you know how when you were talking about the play parks, if I remember correctly, there was a wage structure, and I know that the first drop that was going to come to us was about 298,000. But I think that when you take off basically the wages, which I think is actually fair, to be honest with you, for somebody to actually go in and then actually look at everything and, you know, and keep everything up to date. I just remember we had a situation with car parking spaces, and it was just, you know, people had moved on, and it was one of those things that get put to the side, and nobody really knew how many disabled car parking spaces that we actually had. Therefore, to work it out, we would need to actually set time aside to have somebody to actually do it. So I think that it will be worthwhile taking the staff on for them to do that. What I do remember was, though, that once you took the staff costs off, I think the way it worked out was it was going to be something like about £940 that would be like left over for each of the play parks. And for me, it was more a case of, I was thinking, right, okay, we would need to ask the question was, what would the strategy be? Because would it be done on a priority basis? I don't know if there's anything else you want to say about that. And the other thing that I was going to say was, for me, it was like 60 million, which sounds like a lot of money, but basically it then gets divvied out amongst the 32 local authorities. It then doesn't go to that much. And it was more, Jackie, I wanted to actually ask you, was, so there's obviously the 5 million that's been the drawdown that's get split amongst the authorities. When's the other 55 million coming?
We don't have that information yet. We're awaiting to be told when we'll get that. Right. So what I can tell you is, of £60 million, our normal share, depending on how it's distributed, but our normal share would be around about £3.5 million.
Right, okay. Right,
that
okay.
was in the paper. That was in the paper the other day that we had on it. My worry is, well, the original announcement said it was to refurbish every play park in Scotland, not just prioritise certain ones, but to refurbish every one. And 60 million doesn't even, it wouldn't even put a coat of paint on every play park in Scotland, let alone actually refurbish them with the sort of things that we've been doing sort of down here in Clydesdale with the wind farm money. As I say, I don't think that one of them has cost less than 100,000, and the most expensive one was 175,000. Most of them are coming in the low 100 and a bit thousands. So there's just no way that 3 whatever million it will be enough to do the job. That's why I was slightly concerned that that almost 10% of that money has been spent on more staff rather than more swings. But as I say, it was a comment rather than a question.
No, that's fair dues. Does anybody else have anything they want to say? No, we're good. Right, okay. So I'll just look to move that paper or that item. Can I have a seconder, please?
Yes.
I'll second it.
Jerry, will you second the next one? I'll get Eric to do that one.
Aye, no problem.
Right, okay, cool. Thank you. Right, okay, so we'll move on then to 3B. So this is our Housing Capital programme. So this is pages 27 to 34. And Jackie, I'll hand over to you just now.
Thank you. So again, we're covering the same period. This is up to the 13th of August, but this time it's the Housing Capital programme. 4.1 reports that the programme for the year was £94.4 million. However, we are reporting at 4.2 that we have reviewed the housing programme, and it was proposed that projects totalling £14.7 million would move into next financial year, and that reflects revised timescales and completion dates across a number of sites, and they're detailed there for you at section 4.2. As at the 13th of August, we have spent just over £26 million, and that's covered at section 4.6. Again, we're making reference to the contract prices in this report because obviously that affects the housing programme as well as the general services programme. In the appendices, we're covering similar information as we did in the last report. So Appendix A covers income. And as you know, the majority of the funding for the capital programme for housing comes from borrowing and from the housing revenue account. There's no issues in terms of funding. And we've got our pretty graph that shows our profile of spend and how we are delivering in terms of what our expectations were. Appendix B moves on to the physical progress, and again, Derek can take us through that.
Thanks, Jackie. Chair, the page 32 we're on now, and it's the executive summary there, shows that at period 5, 13th of August, we had 6 projects behind programme, And across the page, on page 33, they're noted. I'll just run down them. Strathcona House, internal area upgrade. We had some delays in the tender production. As with the next one, the Stonefield Bunbury Kelvin Gardens veranda refurbishment, we've also had some delays. And that's primarily my staff through sort of COVID issues and isolation periods. I've had some difficulty there. There's then various properties in Clydesdale noted, which is the window and door replacement contract there, and a couple further down is the ones in East Kilbride, the window and door contract. That says it's delayed due to COVID-19 related issues. I can give members a bit more understanding of that, is that we've actually got staff on COVID duties that would normally fit those windows and doors. So they've been delayed slightly because of that. The project at Newlands Muir, the re-roofing project in East Kilbride, we've got 2 properties that have been impacted by nesting birds, and we have to wait until those flee the nest, and we're then allowed to proceed. And the last one is actually, again, a COVID-related issue. We've had some subcontractor issues delaying the programme of the master fire doors. That's all, Chair.
Okay, that's great. Derek, I'm sorry to hear that you have had difficulty with your staff, with people coming down with COVID, and obviously send whatever we can for the fact that I know it's very difficult. So we do appreciate everything that everybody is doing, and we do totally take that on board. What I would say is, and it's just something I've thought just now, Jackie, and you might say, oh, it's not anything to think about. See, the general revenue grant, would that then be affected if, in this report, there's 1 million that was coming in from I can't remember what it's called, the area, the section 75s, and it's actually in my area, it's the community growth area. So there'll be developers' contributions there, but obviously then there's been the knock-on effect of not getting timber, not getting concrete, which means not as many houses will then basically have built. So that then has a knock-on effect to not getting the developers' contribution, and then obviously not getting the same amount that you would have expected to get in on council tax, because the houses then won't have been built. Is that flagged up here, or is that not shown as a problem yet? Or is that something that you do at in another couple of months when you then say this is what we need and it fits in with their formula?
So what we'll do around council tax is, when we go to refresh our budget for 22-23, we'll look to see what the impact of any delays in house building would mean for us. At the moment, we're not getting any indication that there is an issue for us. We obviously build in an estimate for house numbers and the implications for council tax. But obviously this year, we have been highlighting that there could be a risk depending on how the recovery progresses. I believe that there's a kind of a bullish attitude by house builders, or there was a bullish attitude where things were progressing really well. We might have that hurdle of supply chain issues to go over. We might see the bubble burst, at some point where this pent-up demand is perhaps starting to wane a little. But that's something that myself and Lorraine, as part of our revenue budget strategy, keep an eye on. Okay, that's grand. Listen, thanks very much.
So now that I've had my overindulgence, I'll open up to the floors then if you get any questions. You're so getting off easy. Right, okay, that's grand. Right, I'll look to move this. Jerry, will you second me?
Yes, sorry, I couldn't find my mute button there. Yes, I'll second that.
That's great, thanks, Jerry. Right, okay, Derek, are you off-ski now? Right, okay.
Yes, thanks, Chair.
Thank you very much for all you do when you're with us. We greatly appreciate you, and we'll see you next time, okay?
Thank you.
Cheers, Derek. Okay, so Jackie, then I'll head over to you. So this is for the item number 4. This is the revenue budget monitoring, and this is pages 35 to 46.
Thanks, Chair. So we're now moving on to revenue, again covering the same period up to the 13th of August. What I would start by saying is the messages in this report are very much in line with what I've been reporting previously, just 1 month on. As always, with your permission, we'll focus on the COVID position first of all, and then we'll move on to the non-COVID position. That's the way that this report is drafted. So Section 4, first of all, covers our COVID position for this year. And Section 4.1 just reminds us around what funding we have available that can contribute towards any costs that have come out of the pandemic. So we had £57 million of funding that is available, and that is made up of reserves that we carried forward from last year and also new funding that we received this year. We know that 15.8 million of that funding is for specific things, mainly education, where we were given pots of money to do things like spent on teachers, digital inclusion, those kind of things. That left £31.9 million available for other COVID costs. Section 4.3 gives an update on what we've spent to date in relation to COVID. And there's a table there, table 1 at section 4.4 that summarises that. So we've spent £7.9 million, and of that we have specific funding of £4.9 million to cover those costs, and that leaves just over £3 million of non-specific COVID costs that we'll meet from our pot of money. We do expect that we were intending to spend around about £18.2 million this year on COVID costs that would come from that funding, and we'll continue to monitor that. Obviously, as we've moved further into recovery and social distancing rules have changed, we do expect that we can recalibrate how much we expect to spend. We also know that moving into 2022-23, we do expect that there will still be some residual costs that we will have to meet, and therefore any unspent COVID money this year will pay for those going into next year. As I've reported before, those figures do not include costs in relation to social care for adults and older people. That's covered separately, where the Scottish Government provide funds through what's known as the mobilisation plan, and they cover health and social care costs. Spend to period 5 in relation to those costs for the council total just over £6 million. We do expect that that will be fully funded from the government. Section 5 then goes on to talk about non-COVID costs, very much in line with what we reported last time. If I remove COVID from the council spend position, we are seeing an overspend of just over £400,000, not million pounds, £400,000, and that relates to our social work services that don't fall under the Integrated Joint Board, our children and families. And that's in relation to the number of residential, school and external placements that we know can be very expensive for one individual placement. Our estimate of the full year was at this point about £1 million, over and above £1.4 million already identified within our COVID estimates. So we appreciate that some placements have had to be made as a result of the pandemic, where family relationships may have broken down, but we're anticipating a further overspend of over £1 million in relation to children and families. We are reviewing those costs to see if any of those costs are actually due to the pandemic as well. And at section 5.3, we cover our loan charges. So we've already included as part of our budget strategy for next year that we will have an underspend in this year's loan charge expenditure of £1.6 million. So that's already accounted for in next year's budget. What we are doing is continuing to monitor our levels of spend on capital and how much we will borrow this year. And depending on our level of spend and when we will borrow, we may in turn have further underspends in our loan charges. And we'll come back in future budget papers with a position on that. At section 5.5, we pick up on progress of spend of our investment monies for this year. So you'll recall, as part of our approved budget, there was just over £10 million identified for spend on investments. As planned, that spend will take place over multiple years, this year and the next 2 years. We anticipate spend of £5.5 million this year, and the remaining £4.5 million will be carried forward and spent next year and the year after. Section 5.6 just picks up on some additional funding that we've received in since the last report. That includes Smarter Choices, Smarter Places funding for community and enterprise resources, and education have been advised of funding in relation to additional teachers and support assistants. money to allow music tuition charges to end, and also money to allow other curriculum charges to end as well. Section 6 covers the housing revenue account position, and it shows a break-even position up to the 13th of August. The appendices are there for your information as well. Appendix 1 shows our COVID cost estimate for the year. And then Appendix 2 starts to show our revenue spend over our departments in the usual format. And then the same information on Appendix 2B, but broken down over the type of spend, such as employee costs or property costs. And the paper that Lorraine will cover in a second, obviously will break that down into more detail. Appendix 3, as always, shows full details of what we've spent in relation to COVID. Housing revenue account is picked up in Appendix 4 as there as well for your information. So that's the report, Chair, and I'm happy to take any questions. Thanks.
Okay, that's great. Thanks very much for that, Jackie. It's very well laid out, as always.
Thank you.
So, Eric, you've got your hand up first.
Hi, you escaped questions on the last paper because I would have only asked the same ones I asked on the first paper, so I already got the answers. On this paper, though, two things. One, the 1.65 million saved on 5.3, page 37, loan charges. Is that simply from delaying taking borrowing?
Correct.
Nod of the head. Fine.
Correct.
Absolutely. Perfect. And 5.5, spend profile on investment.
Yes.
What do you mean by investment?
As part of the approved budget this year, there was just over £10 million of funds identified that would be invested on a one-off basis. I can provide for you the note of the meeting on the 27th of February that detailed that. I've made up that date as February. Could be the 22nd, could be the 27th. And there was a number of projects, Councillor Holford, that included £2 million for roads and pathways, some money for for education recovery, a number of projects.
That's fine. Your idea of investments and my idea of investments are not necessarily the same thing. So we come from different worlds. No, that makes sense. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Jenny.
Thanks, Chair. I'm just a wee bit concerned about the overspend in children and families. Is there any way that we could find out if that is going to be related to COVID, or is this going to be an ongoing? Because what I'm concerned about is we're going to have to plug this gap somewhere along the line of that £1 million, and I don't want that to come up in our budget where we're having to basically cut services elsewhere. At the end of the day, we don't have an infinite amount of money, and that is actually quite concerning. So I kind of would like to know as soon as possible if this is going to be an ongoing expenditure, or if this is just basically going to be a one-off and think, well, I appreciate it, costs will go up year after year, and children, are a priority and they have to be looked after, whatever way that does. But I'm just a wee bit concerned if we can find out, whether that is related to COVID or if this is going to be ongoing expenditure.
No, great question.
I can give you what we know at the moment, Councillor Gray. Obviously, these placements have been made for these children because that was what was best for that child at that time. Even if that placement was because of COVID, that doesn't necessarily mean that young person will come out of that placement. It will depend on the needs of the child. And even in an environment without the pandemic, we know that particular service is demand-led, unfortunately, depending on the children that require to be placed at any given time. So I can't give any guarantees that this is a one-off and everything will get back to normal going forward. But it's very much an area that has always been on our eyesight around the pressures in that particular budget line. There have been investments made. Again, sorry, Councillor Holford, for that use of word again, but we have put more money into that budget in the past because there has been pressures there, and there's a number of initiatives and ways of working that social work employ to try and have an early intervention approach to try and avoid placements for children, because that's perhaps not the outcome that you would want. But depending on the nature of the young person's issues or the reason for the placement, sometimes they're unavoidable. So absolutely, it's one that we're very keen to understand if these are as a result of the pandemic, but I can't give any guarantees that they'll not be recurring into future years, but it's something that we have to consider as part of our budget going forward.
Sorry, Chair, just a wee supplementary. I completely understand that, Jackie, and I know that it's demand-led service because I have worked with social work, in the past, and I know you can't make any guarantees or provisions that this is going to happen, because obviously it will depend on, what situations crop up. But as I say, it is obviously, this is obviously something that we look at, but I would hate to think that we're maybe looking at cutting something else, but the needs of the child come first, absolutely, 100%.
Okie dokie. Did that answer it enough, Jerry, though?
No, that's absolutely fine. I would just basically kind of like, go forward with that, but fine.
No, that's fair dues. Right, okay. Any other questions? Okay. Right. Well, who wants to second Grant the passing of that paper?
Yes, happy to second.
Thank you very much. It's much appreciated. Right. Okay. So what we'll do then is we'll move on to the detailed resource analysis. So this is pages 47 to 110, and Lorraine's going to take us through this.
Thank you, Chair. First resource then, as always, is community and enterprise resources, and that starts on page, let me just say 49.
47.
Right, okay. I've got 49 in my pack.
I wonder if the CMSs, Carol, was there a thing on this? In fact, I think you maybe sent out an email. Was it the numbers were different or something?
I think the report starts on page 47, but the first appendix is on page 49.
Apologies, Lorraine, apologies.
No bother at all. So community enterprise is on page 49. And again, bottom right-hand corner shows the position for the resource at the end of accounting period 5. So we're showing 1.939 million over. 1.033 of that relates to COVID in terms of expenditure, and then the vast majority of the rest of it relates to lost income in terms of the service areas. So the vast majority of the pressure within the resource is coming from COVID. In terms of new variances, they start on page 51. There are only 3 new variances in the resource. So in the middle of page 51, we have cleaning and janitorial supplies and equipment, an overspend there of £47,000, and almost all of that is being attributed to COVID, 43,000 of that. The next line down, I've highlighted that one down, I don't know why. Sorry, the next page down, fleet services, we have leasing in the middle of the page, that's on page 52. 53,000 of an overspend. 60,000 is attributed to COVID, so there's obviously a slight underspend elsewhere within the resource, and that's due to leased vehicles being retained on extensions to aid in carrying out of service delivery as a result of COVID-19. The next line down again is a new variance in the resource, it's the final one, and that's fleet services hires, 67,000 of an overspend there, 61 relating to COVID, and it's the same variance explanation for that spend line as well. And that's all for community enterprise resources.
Okay, I'll open it up to questions then. Eric.
Very quick question. See me answer it asking it over and over again. These items, they're attributed to COVID. They come out of COVID funding, so I shouldn't really worry about them at all.
Yeah.
Thank you.
I think the only thing to worry about it, Eric, is that they are coming out of funding just now, because obviously we've got consequentials that have been passed on, but it's a simple case of these costs, pandemic, last 5 to 7 years, and it's just, that's when we've got to worry about we're okay for this year, it's next year and the year after and the year after that.
Is in the back of my mind that this £18 million of COVID funding is a finite amount of money, and I'm always looking at it and thinking, how quickly are we getting through it? But I'm quite sure that Jackie and Lorraine are doing the same. So
No, and I thought it was good the other day, to be honest with you, last week when we were talking about it in council. I can't even remember what committee it was about, and it was about, no, it's not just like free money, just to get spent on something. It's actually need to be very, very wise about how we actually spend this money, because Jerry raised a valid point earlier on, and it was to do with, children's services and whatever else. We need to make sure that we've actually got the right, that we've got money to spend on what we really need to spend on, and the COVID money isn't going to last forever. So no, definitely. Does anybody else have any other questions on this resource? Getting off easy with this one, Lorraine. Okay, do you want to move on then?
Okay, education is next, and their summary statement is on page 61. They show a position of 236,000 over as at period 5, and 117,000 of that is in terms of COVID expenditure, with income pressures in the rest of the resource. Education's variance explanations start on page 62. There's only 2, I think, new ones this period. The first, in fact, they're both on that page. So the first is electricity, 62,000 over, being attributed to COVID, and that's in relation to ventilation requirements within schools and establishments. And I'm lying again. I seem to be highlighting the wrong things when I'm doing this. I shouldn't do it too quickly. The next page, page 63, pupil transport is the other line, which is new this period, 39,000 over, always obviously within schools. It's a demand-led service and reflects the volume of children requiring mainstream transport to schools and a level of increased costs that they're experiencing. And that's all for education. Thank you.
Okay, that's fine. And you're far too hard on yourself, because you're very good at your job and we appreciate you greatly. So, there. Eric, you've got a question?
Yeah, the property costs, electricity overspend, and actually the gas overspend is still there as well. Is this, I know this was raised on last month's paper as well. Is this getting worse? Is it an accelerating problem, or is it being tagged back a little?
Sorry, can I jump in? I think I raised this, but I think it might have been at education I raised it. I can't remember. I did say it was something, and I think that they said they actually had a plan for how they were going to do it, because otherwise it's not very green and climate friendly.
Yeah, I can comment on the financial position. In terms of operationally how they're managing it, I'd revert back to my colleagues in education, but financially I would expect the cost to go up as the winter period comes in, because the cost that we're showing just now will obviously reflect the period between April and now, and that obviously has schools being closed in that period, and also it's not the coldest period of the year. So during the winter, when ventilation will have to be increased, the chances are, the likelihood is that the costs will go up. But that's the COVID costs, and we'll pick that up through that COVID pot of money.
Okay, cool. Eric, what were you going to
say? No, I was just, when the weather gets cold, I appreciate we need to maintain ventilation, but you can't heat the entire planet. You will heat the entire planet by burning all those fossil fuels, but not in a good way.
Agreed. Okay, does anybody else have any questions for this resource? Nope. Okay, then we'll just move on.
Okay, the next resource is finance and corporate resources, and it starts with its summary position on page 71. Bottom right hand corner shows the overall position, 1.759 of an overspend there, 1.776 of additional costs in relation to COVID. So the resource as a whole are pretty much break even if you take that into account. In terms of new variances, there are a few new variances in the resource. If you'll indulge me, I'll pick up on the larger ones just so that we can get through them.
Okay.
So starting on page 73, at the top of the page there, we have computer equipment maintenance, 67 of an underspend there, 57 relating to IT services particularly, and that reflects current levels of spend on licence and server costs at this point in the year, so it's an underspend there. Free school meals is partly down at page 73. 50,000 of an overspend there relating to the provision of school meals during the Easter holidays and to those children self-isolating, and it's offset by Scottish Government funding, so there's no overall issue to the resource there, it's just an expenditure and an income variance. If I can take you over to page 74, We've got a couple of big variances there within transfer payments. This isn't unusual. It's a very difficult budget line to predict. And at the moment, we've now been highlighted an underspend of 890,000 in rent allowance, all within finance transactions. And we've got a rent rebate underspend as well of 226,000 again within finance transactions. They reflect the demand-led provision for housing benefit for private housing tenants and for council housing tenants respectively, and both of them are offset by additional income. Over the page, at the top of page 75, IT equipment leasing contract showing an overspend of 246,000. That's within IT services, and it relates to the leasing of IT equipment, and again is offset by an income recovery, and that's in relation to recharges to resources. So it's simply again reflecting the level of service provision at this point in the year. And then the next two lines below that are the offsets for the rent allowance and rent rebate position. So we've got an under recovery on both of those lines, offsetting the underspend on the other side of the house. And that's all for Finance and Corporate. Thanks, Chair.
Okie dokie. Right, I'll open it up then to questions. Any questions for this resource? Might be getting through this quicker than what you thought, Lorraine. Right, okay, we'll move on.
Okay. Housing and Technical Resources is on page 83, nearly read out the number, page 83, and the overspend is 131, and that's all sitting within the COVID expenditure line. In terms of new variances, we have only one new variance, that's on page 84, and that's in relation to security costs, 68,000 of an underspend there within property services, and that's reflecting the level of security required, which varies, depending on the current workload demands and the timing of both capital and revenue works. And that's all for Housing and Tech.
Okay, open it up to questions. No. Okay, just move on then, Lorraine, that's fine.
The housing revenue account page is sitting on page 93. Jackie picked that up and she went through the summary paper earlier. There's no new variances to highlight in that service area this period.
That's fine. Just move on then.
Okay. So social work then is the last one. That starts on page 99 with the summary table showing a 960,000 overspend. At the bottom, we've got 517 of that relating to COVID, and you can see there the pressures that we talked about earlier in relation to children and families. In terms of new variances, there are I think only three. So the first one is at the top of page 100, and that's admin and clerical staffing within justice services. It's an underspend there relating to vacancies of which they are actively recruiting for. Over the page, at the top of the next page, within care staff, within adults and older people, we have an underspend there again, and again it's vacancies which they are recruiting for. And the third one is children and families, and that's at the top of page 103. We have overspend there within the long-term care line, 219,000 in children and families, and that reflects the increased requirement for children's residential external school placements. And that's all for social work.
Okay, that's great. Thank you very much. Do we have any questions from the floor? No? Right, okay. Well, if there's no questions, I'll just look to move that paper and I will look for a seconder. Eric?
I'll second you.
Thank you. Walter will second me. Eric, were you going to ask a question?
Sorry, you're on mute, Councillor.
You're on mute.
Had to do it one time. No, it wasn't really about the content of the paper, just the layout of it. When I went through the other day, I highlighted all the underlined things so that I could see them. I just noticed that on social work, they're not underlined in the subjective line. I don't know why, but it was only a thought. Should perhaps they ought to have been. They are in all the other cases, so just that one paper, so I missed them.
That's fine, I'll pick that up for next time. Thank you.
Anyway, that's it.
Thank you. Cheers. Away for some water.
Oh, excuse me. That's me crying. Apologies, I had a coughing fit. There is no other urgent business. So we'll close the meeting and thank you very much.
Thank you.
Everybody have a nice day and I'm going to stop coughing.